My father called me ungrateful on Thanksgiving, but they must regret that. I stood up and, my name is Lily Monroe and I'm 28 years old. I'm telling you my story because for a long time I didn't have a voice. My family made sure of that, burying it under years of guilt and expectation. But I have one now and I plan on using it. Last Thanksgiving was the night I finally stopped being their punching bag. The scene was perfect, almost suffocatingly so. The turkey was still steaming on the dining room table, a golden brown monument to my stepmother's obsession with appearances. The fancy candles she always bought were flickering, casting long dancing shadows on the walls and glinting off the polished silver. The air was thick with the scent of roasted food, expensive wine, and the rehearsed sound of family laughter. I sat there, a ghost at their feast, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach with every forced smile. I could feel the weight of their collective gaze, the silent judgment that had followed me my whole life. There was a brief lull in the conversation, and I felt my father's eyes land on me. His expression was one I knew well, not hot anger, but a cold, weary disappointment that was far more cutting. He cleared his throat, and his voice sliced through the hum of the room like a shard of ice. "You're ungrateful, Lily. After everything we've done for you." His words landed, and the rehearsed laughter died instantly. My stepmother Paula let out a small, sharp laugh, a sound like a gavel falling, signaling to the rest of the table how they should feel. A few other relatives chuckled nervously. For years, that accusation would have felt like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless with shame. But this time was different. Instead of pain, I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. The knot in my stomach dissolved. His words were just noise. I looked him dead in the eye, and my voice came out low and steady. It didn't even feel like my own. "You're right, Dad. I'm done being grateful for pain." Then I stood up, and what I did next turned their perfect holiday into the reckoning they never saw coming. Before I tell you how everything flipped, how one disastrous dinner changed my entire life, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from. Every family has a hierarchy, a pecking order. In ours, I was the afterthought. I wasn't at the bottom of the ladder. I felt like I wasn't even on it. I was just the girl who happened to be in the family portraits, usually standing slightly off to the side, a little out of focus, as if I'd wandered into the frame by accident. It's a strange thing, to grow up in a house and feel like a guest, to share a last name with people who feel like strangers. My father is Gregory Monroe. If you live in this state, you've probably seen his name in glossy gold letters on a construction site, or read about him in the business section of the newspaper. Monroe Construction is an empire he built from what he called grit and determination, and he never let anyone forget it. He was a man made of concrete and steel, firm in his beliefs and immovable in his judgments. He saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities. You were either building something, contributing to the legacy, or you were taking up space. He loved things that were successful, things that reflected well on him. That's why he loved my brother, Ethan. Ethan was the golden son, the heir apparent, the asset that would one day yield the greatest returns. He was 2 years older than me, worked for my father, and was being meticulously groomed to take over the company. He looked like a younger, more polished version of my father, talked like him, and possessed the same easy, unearned confidence that made people want to please him. The world bent for Ethan. If he got a C on a history paper in high school, my father declared the teacher incompetent and threatened to call the school board. When Ethan closed his first big deal, a deal my father had personally curated and handed to him on a silver platter, there was a champagne toast at dinner where my father spoke of him as if he were a young titan of industry. I remember watching them, father and son, two sides of the same coin, and feeling a profound sense of otherness. I did not belong to their world of ambition and conquest. Then there was Paula, my stepmother. My real mother, the one who gave me my love for art and my quiet nature, died from a swift and brutal bout of cancer when I was 9. She was warmth and light and the smell of lavender. Her absence left a void that was quickly and efficiently filled by Paula a year later. Paula wasn't cruel in the way you see in fairy tales. There was no locking me in a closet or forcing me to do chores. Her cruelty was quieter, cleaner, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. It was the art of the subtle jab, the backhanded compliment, the concerned tone that was actually dripping with judgment. Paula's primary role was managing our family's public image. She was the CEO of appearances. She chaired charity galas, organized flawless holiday parties, and curated our family portraits with the precision of a museum director. In those photos, we were the perfect family, wealthy, happy, and stable. Her love was conditional. It was a currency she paid out for achievements she could brag about to her friends at the country club. Ethan provided her with a constant stream of income. I, on the other hand, was a financial drain. My life was quieter, my ambitions smaller and less tangible. I had no interest in joining the construction empire. The world of steel beams and zoning permits felt cold and foreign to me. I was a graphic designer. I worked for a small but respected firm downtown, and I was good at my job. I loved the challenge of translating an idea into a visual language, of creating something beautiful and functional out of nothing. It was my own small way of building things. I had just been promoted to a senior designer role, a position I had worked tirelessly for, often staying late and taking on extra projects to prove my worth. When I finally got the news, I was ecstatic. I felt a sense of pride that was entirely my own. I made the mistake of sharing this news with my family. I called home, my voice buzzing with excitement. Paula answered. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she'd said, her voice flat. I could hear the disinterest. "Just remember not to brag about it at work. Humility is such an important quality in a woman. No one likes a show-off." There was a pause, and then she said, "Did you hear Ethan landed the new waterfront development project? Your father is taking us all out to celebrate." I had hung up the phone and stared at the wall in my apartment. My own space, filled with my art books, my plants, and my comfortable, slightly mismatched furniture, suddenly felt like a million miles away from their world. I wasn't bragging. I was sharing a piece of my life, a moment of joy. But to them, my achievements were small, quaint. They were brochures, as my father would later call them. Ethan built skyscrapers that changed the city skyline. I designed pamphlets that people threw away. In their eyes, there was no comparison. This dynamic had been the backdrop of my entire life. I remember my 16th birthday. Ethan's 16th birthday, 2 years prior, had been an extravagant affair held at a downtown hotel ballroom. There was a live band, catering from the city's best restaurant, and nearly 200 guests. My father had given a speech about Ethan being the future of the Monroe name. For my 16th, my father and Paula took me and Ethan to a quiet, stuffy steakhouse. The entire dinner, the conversation was about Ethan's college applications. My father didn't even mention my birthday until the waiter brought out a small slice of cheesecake with a single candle. "Make a wish, Lily," he'd said, already checking his watch. I wished I could disappear. Every visit home was a variation of that same theme. It felt like walking onto a stage in the middle of a play for which I had no script. The conversation always revolved around Monroe Construction, Ethan's latest success, or Paula's upcoming charity event. I would sit on the plush, cream-colored sofa that no one was ever truly comfortable on, nursing a glass of water, while the conversation flowed around me like a river. If I tried to jump in, to share a story about my work or a book I was reading, the topic would be politely acknowledged and then immediately rerouted back to something more important. "That's interesting. Lily," my father would say, a vacant look in his eyes, before turning to my brother. "Now, Ethan, about the zoning permits for the downtown project. They called these gatherings family tradition. They were held in the sterile, perfectly decorated house I grew up in, a place that never truly felt like home after my mom was gone. Paula had redecorated, replacing my mother's warm, eclectic style with shades of beige and gray. It was a museum of a family, not a real one. The photos on the wall showed us smiling on ski trips and beach vacations, but they were lies. They were props for the life Paula wanted everyone to see. The reality was the quiet humiliation served with dessert. It was the sting of being ignored, the exhaustion of trying to earn a single scrap of genuine praise, and the slow, painful realization that I would never be enough for them. Because I wasn't Ethan. I wasn't a reflection of my father's success. I was just Lily, the invisible daughter, and for years I accepted it. I learned to survive by making myself smaller, by expecting less, by finding my validation elsewhere, in my work, in my friendships, in the quiet solitude of my own apartment. I smiled, I stayed quiet, and I pretended it didn't hurt. That was my role. The polite, unassuming, invisible girl who was just grateful to be there at all. I almost didn't go that year. In fact, I had already firmly decided I wouldn't. The annual Thanksgiving performance at my father's house had become a source of profound dread, a holiday I survived rather than celebrated. The thought of sitting at that long, polished mahogany table, forcing a smile while my brother was toasted for merely existing, felt like deliberately swallowing shards of glass. For what? To maintain a fragile illusion of family that I no longer believed in? I had promised myself I was done with that. My plan for the day was my own quiet rebellion. I was going to wake up early, drive out to the state park, and take a long hike through the crisp autumn air. I would come home, put on my most comfortable sweatpants, and watch old black and white movies while I cooked a small, perfect roast chicken just for myself. There would be no forced conversation, no backhanded compliments from Paula, No feeling of being a ghost at my own family's feast. It sounded like peace. It sounded like freedom. It sounded, for the first time in a long time, like a Thanksgiving I could actually be thankful for. For the past few years, my attendance at family events had dwindled. I had become an expert at crafting plausible excuses, a looming work deadline that couldn't be moved, a close friend going through a crisis who needed my support, a sudden but thankfully brief flu. Each excuse was a small brick I placed in the wall I was building around myself, a wall to protect me from the hollow feeling of being unseen in a room full of people who were supposed to see me best. The less I went, the less I hurt. It was simple, self-preserving math. But then, my father called. It was a Tuesday evening, just 2 days before Thanksgiving. I was in my kitchen, sketching out a logo idea, when my phone buzzed. Seeing his name, Gregory Monroe, flash on the screen sent an immediate, familiar clench deep in my stomach. Our calls were usually brief, transactional affairs. He'd ask if I was doing okay as a perfunctory opening. I'd say yes, and then he'd pass the phone to Paula to coordinate the logistical details for the next required family appearance. There was never any real conversation, no genuine curiosity about my life. This time was different. "Lily," he said, and his voice was missing its usual booming executive edge. There was a softer quality to it, a quieter tone that was so unfamiliar, it immediately put me on high alert. "Are you busy?" "Not right now," I replied cautiously, putting my pencil down. Good, he said. There was a pause and I heard him clear his throat. "Your stepmother and I were just talking. We know you've been distant lately. And we were hoping you'd come for Thanksgiving this year. We've invited the Hendersons. You remember Bill Henderson from the club? Anyway, it would mean a lot if you came, Lily. Family should be together on the holidays." The words hung in the air between us. Family should be together. The sentiment was so simple, so pure, but coming from him, it felt foreign and complicated. A part of me, the cynical, wounded part that had been my primary defense mechanism for years, immediately recognized it as a manipulation. The Hendersons were coming. Bill Henderson was a potential investor in my father's new golf course development. My father wasn't inviting his daughter. He was casting a role in his play. He needed the family portrait to be complete for his audience. He needed both his children at the table for the performance of the perfect, stable family to be believable. But there was another part of me, a smaller, more stubborn part that refused to be extinguished completely. It was the 9-year-old girl inside me who still missed her dad, the one who remembered a time before Paula, before the empire became everything. I remembered him pushing me on the swings at the park, telling me to pump my legs so I could fly to the moon. He called me his little star back then. That little girl heard the uncharacteristic softness in his voice and whispered, "Maybe he means it this time. Maybe he's changed. Maybe underneath it all, they actually miss me." It was a dangerous thought. Hope, I've learned, can be a beautiful and convincing liar. But I was tired of being lonely, and the deep, primal ache to belong, to be wanted by my own family, was a powerful lure. The fantasy of a real Thanksgiving, one where I felt not just tolerated, but truly welcome, flickered to life. "I don't know, Dad," I hesitated. "I kind of already made other plans." "Plans?" he asked, the softness wavering for a second. "What's more important than family, Lily? It's just one day. Paula's been asking about you. It would make her very happy." Another lie. Paula had never once called me just to chat, but he knew which buttons to press. The guilt button. The obligation button. "I'll be there," I heard myself say, the words tasting like surrender. "Wonderful," he said, his normal booming tone returning instantly, the transaction complete. The brief moment of perceived vulnerability was over. "Paula will be thrilled. See you at 3 o'clock sharp." The line went dead. I stood in my quiet apartment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, and felt a tidal wave of regret wash over me. I had betrayed myself, but I had given my word. So, I pushed the doubt down and decided to try. I would make one last effort. I would believe that lie one more time. To show I was coming in good faith, I decided to bring a dessert. Not some store-bought cake, but a homemade pecan pie. It was my mother's recipe. The worn, faded index card with her looping, elegant handwriting was one of my most treasured possessions. Baking that pie was a sacred ritual for me. The process was my way of connecting with her, of feeling her presence in my small kitchen. I measured the flour, remembering her showing me how to level it off with the back of a knife. I toasted the pecans, the warm, nutty aroma filling the air and instantly transporting me back to being a little girl, standing on a stool, watching her effortlessly crimp the edges of a pie crust. Baking that pie was like a prayer. It was more than just a dessert. It was the only piece of my real mother, of our real family that I had left to give them. It was a peace offering, a symbol of the connection I still craved. When I arrived on Thanksgiving Day, the pie carrier clutched in my hands like a shield. The familiar scene was already in full swing. The house was immaculate, smelling of roasted turkey, and the expensive, cloying cinnamon-scented candles Paula favored. Ethan was holding court in the living room, a glass of scotch in hand, recounting an exaggerated story about a difficult negotiation he had brilliantly won. My father stood beside him, beaming with pride, a proprietary hand on his son's shoulder. Paula was fluttering between guests, the Hendersons and a few of my father's other business associates and their wives, laughing at jokes that weren't funny and refilling wine glasses, playing the role of the perfect hostess to perfection. No one noticed me for the first few minutes. I stood in the grand entryway, an invisible ghost in my own childhood home, my mother's pie feeling heavier with each passing second. Finally, Paula's gaze swept over me. "Lily, you made it!" she exclaimed, her voice a little too loud, drawing attention to my late arrival, even though I was perfectly on time. She glided over and kissed the air next to my cheek, her perfume overwhelming. "What's that you have there?" "A pecan pie," I said, managing a small smile. "I made it. It's Mom's old recipe." I saw a flicker of something, annoyance, dismissal, in her eyes before her perfect smile snapped back into place. "Oh, how quaint," she said, taking the carrier from me with a delicate touch, as if it might be contaminated. "I'll just put this in the kitchen. We already have a pumpkin pie from the club, you know, the one your father loves. But I'm sure we can find room for this somewhere." She whisked it away before I could respond. I watched her walk into the kitchen and place it on a crowded counter, next to a stack of mail and a set of car keys, already forgotten. My peace offering, my piece of my mom, relegated to the sidelines without a second thought. The familiar chill settled deep into my bones. Nothing had changed. My father came over and gave me a stiff, one-armed hug. "Glad you could make it," he said, his eyes already scanning the room, looking for someone more important to talk to. His attention was immediately pulled back to Ethan. "Ethan, you have to tell Bill Henderson about the waterfront property deal." I smiled, because that's what polite, invisible daughters do. I found a quiet corner, accepted a glass of wine I didn't want, and watched the performance, feeling my fragile, foolish hope crumble into dust. Dinner was, on the surface, a masterclass in perfection. Paula's staging was impeccable. The table looked like a spread from a home decor magazine. A massive, golden-brown turkey sat enthroned in the center, surrounded by an army of side dishes. In gleaming, ornate silver bowls, impossibly creamy mashed potatoes, bright green beans almondine with perfectly toasted almonds, a jewel-toned cranberry sauce that quivered in a crystal dish, and fluffy dinner rolls nestled in a linen-lined basket. The conversation was light and polished, a carefully managed flow of business talk, golf scores, and polite inquiries about the other guests' children. Children who were all, apparently, excelling at prestigious Ivy League universities, or landing impressive jobs in finance and law. I mostly listened, pushing the rich food around my plate, my appetite having vanished the moment Paula dismissed my mother's pie. I offered a small, practiced smile when the conversation drifted in my direction, but I was a ghost at the feast. I was doing what I always did, making myself smaller, taking up less space, trying to blend into the expensive damask wallpaper. For a while it worked. There was a certain kind of safety in my invisibility. If they didn't see me, they couldn't hurt me. But the peace, as always, was a fragile illusion. Throughout the meal, a series of microaggressions chipped away at my composure. When Bill Henderson asked me what I did for a living, I started to explain my role as a senior graphic designer. Before I could finish my first sentence, my father cut me off. "She's the artistic one in the family," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if describing a child who was good at finger painting. The conversation immediately moved on. Later, when the topic turned to a recent political event, I offered a mild opinion, only to have Ethan laugh and say, "Oh, Lily, you're so naive about how the real world works." He said it with a charming smile, so everyone else at the table chuckled along with him. But the message was clear. Your thoughts are childish and have no value here. The final spark ignited during the lull between the main course and dessert. My father had just finished a lengthy, self-congratulatory story about a new golf course he was planning to build, and Ethan had chimed in with some technical details about the irrigation systems that made the other men at the table nod in solemn appreciation. As the brief sycophantic laughter died down, Paula turned her full attention to me, Her eyes had a predatory gleam that I knew all too well. It was the look she got before she went in for the kill, a move disguised as loving concern. "Lily, dear," she began, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet fake solicitude that set my teeth on edge. "We never get to talk about you. Tell me, are you seeing anyone special? When are you going to settle down? Or do you just like being single at your age?" The table went quiet. Every eye, including those of the guests who barely knew me, turned in my direction. It wasn't a question. It was a public shaming. It was a declaration, delivered with a smile, that I was failing at the one job she considered important for a woman. In her world, a woman of 28 without a man was a problem to be solved, a project gone wrong. My career, my independence, my hard-won contentment, none of it mattered if I didn't have a ring on my finger to validate my existence in her social circle. I felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. I forced a tight, awkward laugh, trying to deflect the laser-like focus of the entire table. "I'm just really focusing on my work right now, Paula. I'm happy with where I am in my life." My father let out a short, sharp snort of derision. It was a sound I had heard my entire life, an auditory punctuation mark that meant one thing: disappointment. It was the sound he made when I told him I wanted to major in art history. It was the sound he made when I showed him my first apartment, which he deemed too small. "Work?" he scoffed, his voice laced with contempt. He waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "You design brochures, Lily. Let's not pretend that's a real career. It's a hobby. A cute little hobby to keep you busy." He then gestured with his fork toward my brother, who was preening under the attention. "Look at your brother. Ethan is building something real. Something that will last. He's creating a legacy. You should be more like your brother." Every word was a hammer blow, systematically dismantling my self-worth in front of a captive audience. Brochures. A hobby. Be more like your brother. He had stripped away all my hard work, my late nights burning the midnight oil, my passion for my craft, and my recent, hard-earned promotion, and reduced it all to something utterly meaningless. He didn't just misunderstand what I did, he held it in complete contempt. By extension, he held me in contempt. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the acidic cocktail of anger and hurt that was rising in my throat. I risked a glance across the table at Ethan. He was staring down at his plate, but I could see a small, smug smile playing on his lips. He wasn't going to defend me. Of course not. Why would he? My perceived failure only served to make his inherited success look that much brighter. He was the sun, and I was a pale, insignificant moon, only visible by his reflected light. I tried one last time to find common ground, to de-escalate, to reclaim a tiny piece of my dignity. "I'm building something too, Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but clear in the sudden silence. "I'm building a life for myself. I'm building peace." It was the wrong thing to say. The word peace seemed to trigger something explosive in him, as if my quiet contentment was a personal insult, a rejection of the high-stress, high-stakes world he valued above all else. He slammed his heavy crystal water glass down on the table. The water sloshed over the rim, and the sharp percussive sound made everyone flinch. "Peace?" he roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "You have the gall to talk about peace in this house? The house that pays for your life? We gave you everything. A good home, the best schools, a safety net you'll never have to worry about. And you throw it back in our faces with this entitled nonsense about peace and brochures. You're ungrateful. You should be on your knees thanking us for everything we've done." The room went completely, utterly still. The only sound was the faint, mocking tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. All the guests, the Hendersons, the other business associates, stared at me, their faces a mask of pity and profound discomfort. They were witnesses to my humiliation, and there it was, that word, ungrateful. It was the word he had used my entire life to shut me down, to control me, to invalidate my feelings. When I cried because he missed my 5th grade school play for a last-minute business dinner, I was being ungrateful for the tickets he bought for the whole class. When I said I wanted to go to art school on the East Coast instead of the state business school Ethan attended, I was ungrateful for the future he had planned for me. When I chose my small, quiet life in the city over the loud, competitive world he lived in, I was being ungrateful for the opportunities he provided. It wasn't a description of my behavior. It was a brand. He had branded me with it, seared it into my skin so that every time I chose my own path, every time I had a feeling that didn't align with his expectations, I would feel the burn of his disapproval and my own subsequent guilt. For 28 years I had carried that brand, but in that moment, hearing it shouted across the Thanksgiving table, the sound echoing in the mortified silence, I suddenly felt the weight of it become unbearable. It wasn't a brand, it was a cage, and I was done living inside it. I looked around that perfectly set table, and for the first time, I saw it not as a picture of elegance, but as a battlefield. I saw the ridiculously expensive china, each plate a silent testament to their obsession with appearances. I saw the gleaming crystal glasses, filled with wine that cost more than my weekly groceries. I saw the faces of the people who smiled at me politely, but whose eyes were now filled with a detached, clinical pity. They weren't seeing me, Lily. They were watching a scene unfold, a bit of distasteful family drama that would make for good gossip on the car ride home. Then my gaze settled on my family. I looked at my father, his face still flushed with righteous anger, his jaw set, absolutely convinced of his own victimhood. I looked at Paula, her expression one of cold, reptilian satisfaction. This was what she wanted. Me, brought low, put back in my place. Her perfect dinner party now had a thrilling, dramatic climax. And I looked at Ethan, who finally lifted his head from his plate and gave me a look of pure exasperation, a look that said, "Just apologize and make this go away. You're ruining everything. For years I would have." That look from Ethan would have been my cue. I would have mumbled a pathetic apology, my eyes fixed on my lap. I would have let the hot tears of shame fall silently, tracking paths through my carefully applied makeup. I would have swallowed the pain, the injustice, the humiliation, and pretended it was all my fault, that I was the one who was too sensitive, too difficult. I would have done anything to restore the family's precious, fragile peace, an artificial peace built on my silence. But something inside me, a core of strength I thought had been eroded to dust by years of their neglect, finally broke. It wasn't a loud, shattering noise. It was a quiet, clean snap, the definitive sound of a chain breaking, a link forged in guilt and obligation, finally giving way. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my heavy silver fork on my plate. The small clink sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence. My hand was trembling, not with fear, but with a surge of adrenaline I had never felt before. I picked up my pristine cloth napkin, held it in my hand for a second, and then let it drop to the table. Then I stood up. My legs felt surprisingly steady beneath me. The simple act of rising to my feet while everyone else remained seated was a shift in power so profound, it was almost dizzying. It sent a ripple of shock through the room. My father, who had been expecting me to cower, stared at me, his mouth slightly ajar, his angry tirade cut short. My voice, when it came out, was calm. It was frighteningly calm, devoid of the hysteria they expected. It was the calm of a clear, cold sky after a violent storm. "You're right, Dad," I began. My eyes locked on his. He blinked, a flicker of relief crossing his face. He thought he had won. He thought I was about to deliver the apology he felt he was owed. "I should thank you," I continued, my voice gaining strength with every word, drawing from a well of resolve I didn't know I possessed, "for teaching me exactly what love isn't. Love isn't a transaction, Dad. It's not a balance sheet where you track everything you've given me and expect repayment in the form of perfect obedience. Thank you for showing me that a father's pride can be a weapon, used to cut down a daughter who doesn't reflect the image you want. Thank you for teaching me that silence isn't peace. It's control. It's the airless room you lock people in so they can't breathe. And thank you most of all for this moment, for reminding me exactly why I stopped wanting to come home." A collective, audible gasp went around the table. Paula's perfectly painted smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure fury. She had lost control of her stage. Ethan muttered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. A final desperate attempt to shut me down. "Oh, here we go again. Can't you just have one normal holiday, Lily?" My head snapped toward him. The years of resentment I had suppressed for my golden boy brother, the 1,000 instances of being overshadowed and dismissed, came boiling to the surface in a wave of ice-cold clarity. "Normal?" I said, my voice sharp and clear, cutting through the thick tension. "You want to talk about normal, Ethan? Is it normal to sabotage your own sister? Is it normal to steal someone's work and pass it off as your own? You told them I wasn't ready for the senior designer promotion at my own company, didn't you? You went behind my back to my boss, your golfing buddy, Frank, and told him I was too emotional for a leadership role. You said I lacked the killer instinct." Ethan's face, which had been a mask of smug annoyance, turned the color of chalk. He hadn't just been caught, he had been exposed. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, looking utterly helpless for the first time in his life. "I have the emails." "Ethan?" I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, which was somehow more menacing than a shout. "All of them." Frank felt so guilty about it, so disgusted with what you asked him to do, that he forwarded me your entire exchange a month ago. He told me to watch my back. So don't you dare talk to me about normal. You didn't earn your success. You don't build anything. You just take what you want, lie when you have to, and wait for Dad to praise you for it. Paula gasped again, this time a hand flying to her chest in a theatrical gesture of a wounded matriarch. Lily, that is a horrible and baseless accusation. You are upsetting our guests. I turned my cool gaze on her. And thank you, Paula, for showing me that a family can be a performance. You are an excellent director. The lighting is always perfect. The costumes are flawless, but the actors are miserable. And I'm done playing my part. My father's jaw was locked so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He was staring at Ethan, then at me, the gears of his pragmatic, businesslike mind slowly, painfully turning. He was calculating the damage. For the first time, he seemed to be at a complete loss for words. The atmosphere in the room had changed. It was no longer just uncomfortable. It was electric with the raw, brutal voltage of truth. The air was thin and sharp. The whole scene, the perfect family, the perfect dinner, the perfect life, was suddenly and irrevocably exposed as a hollow fraud. The room had turned to glass around us, silent, beautiful, and utterly breakable, and I was holding the hammer, ready to let it fall. The silence that followed my accusation against Ethan was heavier and more absolute than anything I had ever experienced in that house. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and polite chatter out of the room, leaving only the raw, ugly truth hanging between us. Ethan's face was a mess of shock and dawning horror. Paula looked as if I had physically slapped her. But it was my father's reaction that I watched most closely. His eyes, which had been blazing with anger just moments before, were now narrowed, filled with a terrifying, calculating coldness. He was no longer a furious father. He was a businessman assessing a threat. "You're lying," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You're hysterical, and you're making things up to hurt your brother because you're jealous." "Am I?" I asked, my voice still steady. I held his gaze, refusing to be the one to look away. Am I jealous? Or am I just finally done with the lies? I turned from him and reached down for the large leather tote bag I had placed by my chair. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The other guests were frozen, their forks hovering over their plates, their faces etched with a desperate wish to be anywhere else. I could feel their eyes on me as I unzipped the bag and reached inside. I didn't pull out my phone or my keys. I pulled out a thick, slightly worn manila folder. I walked back to the table and dropped it. The sound it made as it landed on the polished mahogany surface was not loud, but it was definitive. It was a thud of finality. The folder sat there innocuous and plain, in the middle of all the crystal and silver, a bombshell in a cardboard shell. "Since you brought up gratitude," I said, letting my gaze sweep over my father and then Paula, "I think it's time we talked about what I'm supposed to be grateful for. Let's talk about Mom's trust fund." The name of my mother, so rarely spoken in this house, seemed to hang in the air like a ghost. My father's face, which had been pale, went completely white. Ethan's fork, which he had been clutching in his hand, froze midair. He looked from the folder to me, confusion warring with fear in his eyes. Paula was the first to find her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Lily, this is a private family matter. You are making a scene in front of our guests." She shot a panicked, apologetic look toward the Hendersons. I offered her a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "It was a private matter," I agreed, my voice as sharp and clean as broken glass. "It was private when you and Dad decided to borrow $50,000 from it, just after Mom died. It was private when you told me the fund was underperforming and that the returns were minimal. And it was especially private when you forged my signature on the withdrawal authorization form." My father shot up from his chair, his control finally snapping. The heavy chair legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "Where did you get that?" he barked, his eyes wild as he pointed a trembling finger at the folder. "That's private information." "I got it from Mr. Abernathy," I said calmly. "Mom's estate lawyer. You probably don't remember him. You fired him after the funeral and brought in your own corporate sharks. But Mom was smart. She trusted him more than she trusted you, and she left him with a complete set of original copies of everything. When I started having questions a few months ago, he was more than happy to walk me through the statements, the real ones." I reached out and flipped open the folder. Inside were bank statements, withdrawal slips, and a copy of the trust agreement. On top was a single sheet of paper under a plastic protector. It was the withdrawal form, and at the bottom, in a clumsy, uncertain hand, was a signature that was supposed to be mine. It was a terrible forgery. "You see," I explained to the silent, horrified room, "my mother set up that trust for me. It was my inheritance from her, meant to be used for a down payment on a house or to start a business. It was my future. And you," I looked directly at my father, "you stole it. You stole it to cover Ethan's gambling debts from his first year of college." Ethan made a small, choked sound. "He had told us he'd gotten a student loan. Another lie in a family built on them. We didn't steal it," Paula insisted, her voice rising with panic. "It was a loan. We were going to pay it back." "Were you?" I asked. "It's been almost 10 years, Paula. There hasn't been a single deposit made back into the account. Just more withdrawals." For the country club membership, for your car. You used my mother's money, the money she left to protect me, to fund your lifestyle and clean up your son's messes. The weight of that truth, spoken aloud for the first time, was heavier than any turkey platter. It was suffocating. The guests stared at their plates, at the ceiling, anywhere but at my family. The illusion wasn't just cracked. It had been pulverized. The perfect Monroe family was a sham, and here was the proof, lying in the center of their perfect Thanksgiving table. My father's face was a terrifying sight. The color had drained from it completely, leaving behind a pasty gray pallor. His breathing was ragged, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The calculating businessman was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. All his power, all his control, had been stripped away from him in his own dining room, in front of his own hand-picked audience. He had been exposed and he couldn't bear it. "Get out," he snarled, the words tearing from his throat. "Get out of my house, now." I looked at him, at the man who was supposed to be my protector, and I felt nothing but a profound, aching pity. He wasn't a titan. He was just a bully who had finally met someone who wouldn't flinch. "I already did, Dad," I said quietly, the words filled with a sorrow he would never understand. "I left years ago. You just didn't notice." Emotionally, I had moved out of that house the day Paula moved in. I had left a little more each time my accomplishments were dismissed, each time Ethan was praised for breathing, each time I felt the cold sting of their indifference. My body was the only thing that had kept visiting, out of a misguided sense of duty. Now that was over too. Ethan finally jolted into action, started mumbling something about misunderstandings. "Lily, come on, we can talk about this. It's just a misunderstanding." "No, Ethan," I said, turning to him. "It's the first moment of perfect understanding we've ever had in this family." Even Paula, the master of appearances, looked shaken and lost. Her social armor had been pierced, and she had no script for this scenario. Her guests were witnessing the ugliest of realities, and there was no way to spin it into something palatable. I calmly gathered the papers and slid them back into the manila folder. I picked it up, tucked it under my arm, and walked toward the entryway. I could feel every eye on my back. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my footsteps on the hardwood floor. I reached the door, grabbed my coat from the rack, and slung it over my shoulder. Then I paused, my hand on the cold brass doorknob. I had one last thing to say. I turned back to face them. They were all still frozen in that horrible tableau, a family portrait of ruin. "Oh, and by the way, Dad," I said, my voice clear and carrying easily through the funereal silence. "Mr. Abernathy and I filed a formal complaint last week. The trust has been frozen. The state's auditing all the transfers from the past decade." I let my eyes drift to Paula. "They're particularly interested in forged signatures. Apparently it's a felony. Happy Thanksgiving." The last thing I saw before I turned and walked out the door was my father's face collapsing in on itself, the mask of rage crumbling into sheer, unadulterated terror. I pulled the door closed behind me, the latch clicking shut with a satisfying finality. I was halfway down the stone walkway when I heard it, the distinct and unmistakable sound of glass shattering against a wall. My father's control, his power, his carefully constructed illusion of a perfect life, all of it, breaking apart. I didn't flinch. I just kept walking. The cold November air hit my face, and for the first time all day I could breathe. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The adrenaline that had been coursing through me began to fade, replaced by a profound sense of emptiness. It wasn't a bad emptiness, though. It was a clean slate. A space that had been filled with pain and obligation for 28 years was now, finally, mine to fill with whatever I chose. I hadn't just walked out of a disastrous dinner. I had walked out of the cage they had built for me and into the rest of my life. I drove for what felt like hours, with no destination in mind. The car was a quiet, safe cocoon, the rhythmic thump of the tires on the pavement a soothing mantra. The city lights blurred into long streaks of color through my windshield. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry anymore. I just felt hollow, scoured clean. Finally, driven by a primal need for normalcy, I pulled off the highway and into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. The sign, a cheerful, buzzing neon square, promised good eats. Inside, it was warm and smelled of coffee and bacon. A few truckers sat at the counter, and a family with tired-looking kids was crammed into a booth. It was a world away from the cold, sterile perfection of my father's dining room. It was real. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth and ordered a slice of pumpkin pie and a black coffee. The pie arrived on a thick, heavy plate with a dollop of whipped cream from a can. It was imperfect and overly sweet, and it was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted. I ate it slowly, listening to the quiet hum of conversations around me, the clatter of cutlery, the friendly voice of the waitress calling out an order. I was surrounded by strangers, and yet, for the first time in my entire life, I didn't feel alone. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet, simple contentment that had always been out of my reach. That diner, on that night, was the most peaceful Thanksgiving I'd ever had. The days that followed were strangely silent. I expected a barrage of angry phone calls, manipulative texts, maybe even an unannounced visit, but there was nothing. The silence was absolute, and it was a gift. It was the space I needed to heal, to process the enormity of what I had done. I went to work, I met my friends for dinner, I took long walks. My life continued, but it felt different, as if I had been carrying a 100-pound weight on my back for so long that I hadn't even realized it was there until it was gone. I felt lighter. The first ripple of the fallout reached me about a week later. A distant cousin, one who had always been kind to me, sent me a tentative text. "Hey Lily, are you okay? Aunt Paula is having a meltdown. Something about her charity gala?" I did some digging online. Paula's name, which was usually plastered all over the promotional materials for the city's biggest annual charity ball, had been quietly removed from the host committee. A few days after that, a friend who worked in the same building as Monroe Construction mentioned that there were a lot of hushed, serious meetings happening. Then he sent me another message. "Weird news. Your brother Ethan just took an indefinite leave of absence. The internal memo just said it was for personal family reasons." The cracks were appearing in the Monroe facade. Their perfect world was beginning to fracture from the inside out. Then, one rainy Monday afternoon, my phone rang. The name Gregory Monroe flashed on the screen. My heart hammered against my ribs, a conditioned response from a lifetime of dreading his calls. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the green accept button. I could answer it. I could listen to him rage or plead or blame. Or I could not. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, the notification popped up. A part of me wanted to delete it without listening, to sever the connection completely, but another part needed to know. I took a deep breath and pressed play. His voice was not the booming, angry roar I had expected. It was raspy, broken, the voice of a man utterly defeated. "Lily," he said, his voice thick with a strange mix of self-pity and accusation. "You did this. You ruined us. Everything I built, my name, your brother's future, Paula's reputation, you destroyed it. I hope you're happy." I listened to the message twice. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't ashamed. He was just angry that he had been caught. In his version of the story, he and Paula and Ethan were the victims. I was the villain. Their crime wasn't the theft or the lies or the years of emotional abuse. Their crime was getting caught, and my crime was being the one to expose them. He still didn't get it. He never would. I deleted the message halfway through the second listen. The act of pressing that little red trash can icon felt monumental. It was a final symbolic act of cutting the cord. I was no longer responsible for his feelings, for his reputation, for the consequences of his own actions. His ruin was not my creation. It was his. Ruin looks different from freedom depending on where you're standing. From where he was, his world was ending. From where I stood, mine was just beginning. For 2 weeks, the consequences of that Thanksgiving dinner remained within the private sphere of gossip and rumor. I knew the official investigation was proceeding, a slow, bureaucratic grind happening somewhere behind closed doors, but the public face of the Monroe family, though strained, was still intact. I imagined my father was working furiously behind the scenes, calling in favors from his powerful friends, trying to contain the damage and kill the story before it could ever see the light of day. For a man like him, whose entire identity was built on his public reputation for integrity and strength, the scandal itself was a fate worse than any legal penalty. The containment failed. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I was at my desk, sipping my coffee and reviewing a design proof, when my phone buzzed with a text from a friend. It was just a link to an article from the city's leading newspaper, with a message underneath. "Whoa, is this about your family?" My heart started to pound. I clicked the link. The headline was stark, black and white, and it made me feel dizzy. Monroe Trust Investigation. Prominent local developer Gregory Monroe under review for misuse of family funds. I read the article, my eyes scanning the words, my brain struggling to process that my private pain was now a public document. It was all there. It mentioned an official audit by the state's Financial Crimes Unit. It quoted legal experts on the seriousness of mismanaging a trust and the criminal charges associated with forgery. It didn't have all the sordid details. It didn't mention Ethan's gambling debts or Paula's car, but it didn't need to. The phrase breach of fiduciary duty, repeated several times, was a cold, legalistic term for what I had experienced as a profound and personal betrayal. Seeing it all laid out in the objective, unforgiving language of a news report was a strange and powerful form of validation. I wasn't the ungrateful, hysterical, jealous daughter my father had accused me of being. I was a person whose trust had been violated, whose inheritance had been stolen, and whose story was now credible enough to be printed in the newspaper for the entire city to see. The article spread like wildfire. The Monroe name, once a symbol of honor, ambition, and success, was now tarnished with scandal. The empire my father had built on a foundation of pride and a carefully constructed image began to crumble, one mortifying truth at a time. The whispers that had been confined to country club locker rooms were now front-page news. The public reckoning was swift and brutal. Bill Henderson, the potential investor my father had been so desperate to impress at Thanksgiving, publicly announced he was pulling his funding from the new golf course project, citing the need to work with partners of unimpeachable integrity. A major philanthropic organization, to which Paula had dedicated years of her life to climb to the top of its social ladder, issued a formal statement asking her to step down from the board pending the results of the investigation. Ethan, it turned out, hadn't taken a leave of absence. He had been fired. The company he worked for couldn't afford to have an executive embroiled in a financial scandal. I watched it all happen from a distance, like watching a controlled demolition of a building I used to live in. There was no joy in it, no triumphant glee. There was just a quiet, sober sense of justice. It was the inevitable consequence of their choices. My father had built his name on an illusion of honor. He had sold the world a story about a strong, principled family man, while behind closed doors he was a thief and a bully. I, on the other hand, had spent my life in the shadows, quietly trying to build a small life based on something real, my work, my friendships, my honesty. And in the end, only one of those foundations could withstand the storm. His empire of lies shattered under the first brush with the truth. My small life, built on solid ground, was unshaken. He had accused me of ruining them, but I knew the truth. I hadn't ruined them. I had simply turned on the lights, and the whole world could finally see the mess they had made in the dark. This Thanksgiving, my table was small. There was no polished mahogany, no gleaming crystal, no army of silver serving dishes. My small oak dining table, which I'd bought from a secondhand store and lovingly refinished myself, was set for 4. There was just me, my boyfriend Noah, a kind, steady man who listened more than he talked, and 2 of my closest friends from work. There were no expensive, store-bought flower arrangements, just a simple bouquet of wildflowers in a mason jar. There were no rehearsed stories of business conquests, just easy conversation and genuine, unforced laughter. Instead of a massive turkey, we had a perfectly roasted chicken. Surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans we had all made together in my tiny kitchen, and on the counter, cooling on a wire rack, was a homemade pecan pie. I had used my mother's recipe again, but this time it wasn't a peace offering. It wasn't a desperate plea to be seen or loved. It was a celebration. It was a way of honoring her memory in a space that was safe and filled with real affection. As we sat around the table, the warm light from my small apartment making everything glow, Noah reached over and squeezed my hand. He had been my rock through the past year, patiently listening as I navigated the complicated aftermath of my decision. He never told me what to do. He just reminded me that my feelings were valid. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching mine. He didn't have to specify what he meant. We both knew. I looked at the faces of my friends, laughing at some silly joke. I looked at the simple, delicious food we had prepared. I felt the warmth of Noah's hand in mine. "I am," I said, and the truth of those 2 words settled deep in my soul. I really am. Later, as we were cutting the pie, my friend Sarah asked, "Do you ever miss them?" I thought about it for a moment. I didn't miss the tension, the criticism, the constant feeling of being inadequate. I didn't miss the grand, empty house that never felt like a home. I didn't miss the people they were. But I grieved for the family I should have had, the father I wished he could have been. "No," I said finally. "I don't miss them. I'm grateful now." Noah smiled. "Grateful for what?" I took a bite of the pie. It tasted like my mother's love. It tasted like freedom. "Not for them," I clarified. "I'm grateful for me. For the girl who finally found her voice. For the woman who learned that she was strong enough to walk away. Because gratitude isn't something you owe to the people who hurt you. It isn't a debt you pay for the roof over your head or the food on your table. Real gratitude is the quiet, powerful peace you give yourself when you finally stand up, speak your truth, and build a table of your own."